The rain hammered down against the glass walls of the conference hall as James Carter said, "This can't be happening." His voice cracked as headlines flashed across giant screens. His company had collapsed overnight. Investors were fleeing, employees were panicking, and the press swarmed like vultures. Emma Lewis said, "James, we'll figure this out," her voice soft but trembling. His rival, Richard Cole, stood smugly across the room, lips curled in a victorious smile, whispering to a colleague. The silence in the hall was heavier than the storm outside. James clenched his fists, his breath uneven, his dreams crumbling before the world's eyes. Emma touched his arm, grounding him, while Richard smirked, savoring his fall. James whispered to himself, "Everything I built is gone." His reflection in the rain-streaked glass showing a broken man, not the visionary who once inspired thousands. The next morning, James sat alone in his dim apartment, blinds half drawn, the city's gray light seeping in. Emma said, "You need to eat," placing a plate beside him. He pushed it away, eyes fixed on scattered papers detailing his company's debts. Richard's mocking face replayed in his mind like a nightmare. James muttered, "They trusted me, and I failed them." His phone buzzed non-stop with calls from creditors, but he let it ring endlessly. Emma sighed, sitting across from him, eyes heavy with worry. The air smelled of cold coffee and exhaustion. James buried his face in his hands, whispering, "I don't know if I can survive this storm." James stepped into the elevator of a corporate tower, his head lowered. Whispers followed him as employees avoided eye contact. Richard Cole passed him in the lobby, pausing to grin. Richard said, "Tough week, James." His words were dipped in venom. James's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. A receptionist whispered to a colleague, eyes darting toward him. Emma walked beside James, her eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge the gossip. The elevator doors closed, but James felt the weight of judgment pressing harder than the steel walls. At his office desk, stripped of authority, James stared at an empty chair where his assistant once sat. Boxes filled with files lined the walls. Emma said, "We'll rebuild," her voice firm, though her eyes betrayed fear. James looked at her, his voice bitter. "I don't even know where to start." He traced the rim of a cold coffee cup, the silence choking him. The sound of Richard's laughter from a nearby office pierced through the thin walls, salt in his wound. James whispered, "They're already dividing what's left." That night, James walked alone down a rain-soaked street, neon signs reflecting in puddles. His coat clung to his soaked frame, his face pale under the streetlight. He whispered, "I've lost everything." Cars passed by without noticing him, a man invisible in his own city. Emma's words echoed in his mind, "We'll figure this out." He stopped at a closed diner window, seeing his reflection among empty chairs. For a brief second, he thought of turning back, of calling Emma. But instead he shoved his hands into his pockets and kept walking. James sat at the kitchen table, the early morning light filtering through half-closed blinds, casting stripes across his face. His phone buzzed endlessly, reminders of debt and failure screaming louder with every vibration. Emma said, "James, you can't keep shutting everyone out," her voice both worried and firm. He rubbed his temples and muttered, "I don't have the strength to answer them anymore." The walls of the apartment felt like they were closing in, suffocating him with the weight of shame. Emma leaned forward, her hand resting on his wrist, trying to reach him beyond the walls he had built. James' breathing grew shallow as he whispered, "I thought I was meant for more. But maybe I was wrong." Silence filled the air, broken only by the faint sound of traffic outside, a world still moving while his life remained frozen in failure. James walked into his parents' modest living room, the old clock ticking too loudly in the silence. His mother, Margaret Carter, said, "You're throwing your life away," her voice sharp but edged with fear. James clenched his jaw, whispering, "I tried, Mom, I really did." His father, Daniel Carter, sat stiffly in his chair, arms crossed, refusing to meet his eyes. Emma stood behind James, her hand resting on his shoulder, grounding him against the storm of judgment. Margaret shook her head, her eyes filled with disappointment, whispering, "You had stability. And you chose chaos." James' chest tightened, the voices of doubt cutting deeper than any financial loss. Emma's voice broke the silence. "He's not done yet." The tension hung heavy, the ticking clock, a cruel reminder of time slipping away. Later that evening, James sat across from Emma in a quiet cafe. The rain tapped gently on the windows, a rhythm softer than his thoughts. James said, "They'll never believe in me again." Emma leaned forward, her eyes unwavering, whispering, "Then prove them wrong." He shook his head, staring into his untouched coffee, his reflection rippling in the dark liquid. The cafe was nearly empty, distant chatter fading into background noise. Emma's hand slid across the table, fingers brushing his, a silent vow of loyalty. James sighed heavily, muttering, "What if I fail again?" Emma's reply cut through the noise. "Then you'll rise again, and I'll be there." For the first time in days, James allowed the hint of a smile, fragile but real, flicker across his face. James stood at the window of his apartment, staring at the skyline as lightning cracked across the horizon. His mind replayed Richard Cole's smirk, Margaret's harsh words, and the endless headlines mocking his fall. He whispered, "Maybe they're right." Emma approached quietly, her reflection joining his in the glass. She said softly, "I see someone who's not beaten, just bruised." He turned to her, eyes heavy with exhaustion, muttering, "Bruises fade, but scars stay forever." Emma touched his arm, her voice firmer now. "Scars show you survive." Outside, the storm raged, thunder shaking the walls, but inside her words held a fragile spark of light against his darkest thoughts. The next day, James met Emma at the park, autumn leaves swirling around them. Children laughed in the distance, a cruel contrast to the emptiness he felt. James said, "Do you ever think I should just walk away?" Emma frowned, replying firmly, "That's not you." He sat on a bench, staring at the ground, his hands clasped tightly, knuckles white. Emma sat beside him, her eyes searching his. "You're not defined by failure, James," she said, voice breaking with emotion. He turned slowly, whispering, "But failure defines how they see me." A gust of wind scattered leaves across their feet, and Emma whispered back, "Then change how they see you." For a moment, James' eyes lifted toward the golden trees, light filtering through branches, a hint of hope glimmering in his gaze. James sat on a quiet park bench, the late afternoon sun casting long golden shadows over fallen leaves. Emma said, "You can't carry this alone." Her voice carried a rare firmness. James replied, "Everyone's already turned their backs." A calm presence approached, the figure of David Miller, the retired entrepreneur who had guided countless young leaders. David, leaning on a cane, smiled faintly and said, "Not everyone." James looked up, surprised by the warmth in his voice. David sat down beside him, gazing at the skyline with a knowing look. "You think failure defines you," David said slowly, "but failure is only the tuition you pay for success." Emma's lips curved into the faintest smile, whispering, "I told you he wasn't done." James exhaled, his shoulders relaxing just a little, and for the first time since his collapse, he felt a glimmer of possibility. Inside a quiet bookstore cafe, David opened a worn leather notebook filled with sketches and ideas. He said, "Every empire starts with broken bricks." James studied the pages, his eyes wide, muttering, "This feels impossible." Emma leaned in, whispering, "But it's not hopeless." David tapped the page, his voice steady. "Stop staring at the ashes. Start thinking about the spark." James felt his heartbeat quicken, a forgotten energy stirring. He whispered, "What if I can't rise again?" David smiled knowingly. "Then you'll learn, and you'll rise differently." Emma's hand brushed James' arm, and for the first time in weeks, his posture straightened, his eyes alive with curiosity instead of defeat. That night, James returned to his desk, a pile of crumpled papers scattered across the floor. Emma said, "You don't have to rebuild the same dream." James whispered, "Then what do I build?" His reflection stared back from the darkened laptop screen, his face half hidden in shadow. He thought of Richard's arrogance, his parents' disappointment, David's words. Slowly, he began to sketch a new plan, lines shaky at first but growing bolder. Emma leaned over his shoulder, her voice steady. "This time, you're not alone." James looked at her, his eyes shining faintly, whispering, "Then let's begin again." The night air felt different, carrying not despair but the scent of new beginnings. Days later, James met quietly with Sophia Turner, a loyal friend who had once worked by his side. She said, "I still believe in what you can do." James replied, his voice low, "I can't pay you." Sophia laughed softly. "Belief isn't about paychecks." Emma sat beside him, smiling faintly, whispering, "See, not everyone walked away." James stared at Sophia, the realization sinking in that loyalty had survived his storm. Sophia leaned forward, placing documents on the table. "I've been waiting for you to fight again," she said. James inhaled deeply, whispering, "Then maybe I can." For the first time he felt surrounded not by loss, but by allies ready to rise with him. At dusk, James stood with Emma and Sophia on a rooftop overlooking the city. The sky glowed orange and violet, skyscrapers flickering with life below. James said quietly, "It feels like I'm staring at a battlefield." Emma replied, "Then claim it." Sophia crossed her arms, smiling, "You've got people ready to fight with you." James' heart raced, words caught in his throat. He whispered, "I thought I had to do this alone." Emma took his hand firmly. Sophia nodded with resolve. James turned toward the horizon, a fire returning to his eyes. For the first time since the collapse, he felt the weight of possibility heavier than the weight of failure. James entered the boardroom with Emma and Sophia at his side, the air thick with tension. Richard Cole sat at the head of the table, smirking. Richard said, "Back again, James. I thought you were finished." James clenched his jaw, forcing calm. He whispered, "Not finished, just starting over." Sophia spread documents across the table, her voice sharp. "We have proof your tactics hurt this industry more than they help." Richard laughed coldly. "Business isn't about helping, it's about winning." Emma leaned forward, her tone steady. "Integrity is the only real win." James looked directly into Richard's eyes, fire returning, and said, "I lost once, but I won't bow again." Silence fell, the sound of a ticking clock, echoing louder than words. After the meeting, James stepped into the corridor, his body shaking from the confrontation. Emma whispered, "He won't stop until you're crushed." James replied, "Then I'll rise stronger." Sophia placed a hand on his arm, whispering, "Hell come at you harder now." James' eyes narrowed, his voice steady, "Then let him." At that moment, he felt both the weight of fear and the surge of determination colliding inside him. The polished floors reflected their uneasy faces. 3 allies bracing for a storm. At night, James worked late in his apartment, papers scattered across the desk. Emma said softly, "You've barely slept." James muttered, "Sleep doesn't win battles." His eyes were bloodshot, but alive with fire. Sophia's notes filled the table with strategies, her neat handwriting contrasting his frantic sketches. Emma leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her voice tinged with worry, "You'll destroy yourself if you push too hard." James exhaled and whispered, "Better to burn chasing a dream than fade away in regret." Silence stretched, broken only by the scratch of his pen against paper. The following morning, James met David Miller at a quiet diner. David said, "Richard is ruthless. He'll cut corners and crush anyone." James stirred his coffee, whispering, "Then I'll fight differently." David leaned forward, his eyes sharp despite his age. "Don't try to be him, outsmart him." Emma, seated beside James, nodded, whispering, "We'll fight with integrity, not deceit." David smiled faintly. "That's harder, but it lasts longer." James straightened his shoulders, whispering, "Then harder is the path I choose." The sun streamed through dusty windows, casting light over their table like a quiet blessing. Later that week, James presented his new ideas to a small group of potential backers. He stood at the front of a modest conference room, sweat beading his forehead. Emma whispered encouragement from the side. Sophia handed out documents with steady hands. One investor asked coldly, Why should we believe in you after such a collapse? James took a deep breath, his voice unwavering. Because failure taught me more than success ever could. Silence filled the room as his words landed heavy. Emma's eyes glistened with pride, Sophia smiled faintly, and James stood tall, no longer the man defined by his fall, but by his courage to rise. James walked into the office, clutching fresh plans, hope flickering in his chest. But silence filled the room. Sophia's desk was empty. Emma frowned, whispering, she was supposed to be here. James' pulse quickened as he scanned the room. Suddenly, the phone buzzed with a notification, news headlines flashing Sophia's name alongside Richard Cole. James' voice cracked. No. She wouldn't. Emma grabbed the phone, her eyes widening as betrayal unfolded in bold letters. Sophia Turner had been meeting secretly with Richard, sharing information. James staggered back, whispering, she was with me this whole time. Emma whispered, pained, not with you, against you. His chest tightened, his world collapsing a second time. Later, James stormed into Richard's towering office, the city lights glaring through massive windows. Richard leaned back smugly, Sophia standing beside him, her face unreadable. James shouted, why, Sophia? After everything we built? Sophia's eyes faltered, her voice quiet. I got tired of losing, James. Richard smirked, adding, she chose strength over weakness. James' fist shook, but his voice steadied. No, she chose greed over loyalty. Emma stood at the door, her face pale but resolute. Sophia whispered, you left me no choice. James' heart ached, his dreams poisoned by betrayal, as Richard's laughter echoed like thunder over shattered trust. James sat in his apartment, darkness broken only by the glow of his laptop screen. Emma paced the room, whispering, she betrayed us. But we can't stop now. James' voice shook. How do I fight when my own friend cuts me down? His hands gripped the edge of the desk, veins pulsing under his skin. Emma stopped pacing, her voice fierce, because Richard wants you broken, and Sophia thinks she won. Prove them wrong. James stared at his reflection in the screen, torn between rage and despair. He whispered, I trusted her. Emma leaned closer, whispering, then trust me instead. For the first time that night, James' shoulders straightened, the fire inside him reignited. James met David in a quiet park the next morning, leaves rustling underfoot. His voice cracked, she betrayed me, David. David placed a steady hand on his shoulder, replying, betrayal cuts deeper than failure, but it teaches sharper lessons. James' eyes burned as he whispered, how do I trust anyone again? David's expression softened. You don't need to trust everyone, just the right ones. Emma stood nearby, watching silently, her eyes shining with loyalty that had not wavered. James clenched his fists, whispering, then I'll choose wisely this time. David nodded with a faint smile, then you'll rise wiser, not weaker. The wind carried away James' doubt, leaving behind hardened resolve. That evening, James stood before a mirror, adjusting his suit jacket. Emma whispered, they tried to break you, but they failed. James met his own reflection, whispering, Sophia's betrayal won't define me. He remembered her words, her smile, her trust turned into knives, but he refused to let the wound fester. His eyes hardened, his breath deepened, his body steadied. Emma said firmly, you are stronger because of this. James whispered, then let's show them. He turned from the mirror, no longer the broken man of weeks before, but a fighter ready to carve a new path. The night outside pulsed with energy, mirroring his own rebirth. James entered the grand hall of investors, every seat filled, the air electric with tension. Emma whispered at his side, this is the moment. James inhaled deeply, clutching his notes. Sophia sat across the room, her eyes cool, sitting beside Richard, who smirked like a predator. James' heart pounded, but he stepped forward, voice steady. Failure was my greatest teacher. Murmurs rippled through the room. Richard chuckled under his breath, but James continued, I stand here not as a man who never fell, but as one who refused to stay down. Emma's gaze burned with pride, and even some investors leaned forward, intrigued. James' words pierced through the noise, reclaiming his voice against the silence of doubt. Richard rose suddenly, clapping mockingly. He said a stirring speech, James, but words don't pay debts. His laughter echoed as investors exchanged wary glances. James locked eyes with him, replying firmly, no, but vision does. He revealed bold plans on the screen, data glowing with promise. Emma whispered, show them who you are. James' voice grew stronger. Richard thrives on fear. I thrive on possibility. Sophia shifted uneasily, her eyes betraying cracks in her resolve. Richard snarled, you'll never outshine me. James' response cut through the room, I don't need to outshine you, I need to build what you can't. Silence fell, heavy with choice. The debate grew fierce. Richard sneered, investors want certainty, not a dreamer clinging to ashes. James answered, his voice unwavering, certainty without integrity collapses. The room stirred, whispers spreading like fire. An investor raised his hand asking, why should we trust you again? James steadied himself, replying, because I've walked through fire and survived, because scars teach resilience. Emma whispered, perfect, her eyes glistening. Richard slammed his fist on the table, his composure cracking. Sophia bit her lip, shifting uncomfortably. For the first time, James saw fear flicker in Richard's eyes. He realized the battle wasn't just about money, it was about truth. David entered quietly at the back of the hall, leaning on his cane. His presence drew subtle attention. James caught sight of him and straightened, remembering his words. Outsmart him. James said firmly, this isn't just about business. It's about building something lasting. David nodded from the shadows, pride flickering in his eyes. Richard growled, you'll regret challenging me. James replied, voice sharp, no, Richard, I regret nothing, not even failure. The words struck like thunder, and the investors leaned closer. Emma's lips curved in a faint smile. Sophia shifted again, and David's steady gaze reminded James he was no longer fighting alone. The final moment arrived. Investors whispered among themselves. Then one stood, declaring, we believe in the man who refuses to quit. Applause erupted, cautious but growing. James exhaled, his chest lifting, his eyes locking with Emma's. She whispered, you did it. Richard's face twisted in rage, muttering, this isn't over. Sophia's eyes shimmered with regret, silently watching James claim his victory. David nodded from the back, his quiet smile steady. James stepped away from the podium, whispering to himself, this is only the beginning. The hall roared, and for the first time since his fall, James felt the weight of triumph anchor his soul. The conference was over, yet James lingered in the quiet hall, the echo of applause still reverberating in his chest. Emma touched his arm, whispering, you've earned this moment. James replied softly, I almost lost myself to despair. David approached with his cane, smiling gently, but you found yourself again and stronger. Sophia stood in the shadows, watching with regret in her eyes, her silence speaking louder than words. Richard stormed out angrily, his empire shaken, his arrogance cracked. James inhaled deeply, whispering, this time, it feels real. The weight of years of pain lifted from his shoulders, replaced by something sturdier, hope. The following morning, James walked with Emma along the river, autumn leaves drifting across the water. He whispered, I thought I had to stand alone, but I never did. Emma smiled, her voice tender, you just had to see who stood with you. James chuckled faintly, the sound light for the first time in months. Emma said, you've rebuilt more than a business. You've rebuilt yourself. He stopped to look at his reflection on the rippling water, whispering, and maybe that was the real victory all along. The breeze carried away his doubts, leaving the quiet rhythm of renewal. At his new office, smaller but alive with energy, James gathered his small team. He said firmly, we will build with integrity, even if it's harder. Emma stood beside him, her eyes bright with pride. Sophia entered hesitantly, folder in hand, whispering, if you'll have me, I want to make it right. The room fell silent. James studied her, then said, trust is earned, not given freely. Sophia nodded, eyes heavy with remorse. Then let me earn it. Emma glanced at James, waiting for his decision. He finally said, "We'll see in time." For the first time, hope stretched across the faces of those gathered. That evening, James visited his parents' home. Margaret whispered, "You've changed." Daniel, arms crossed but softer now, said, "You've proven us wrong." James replied, "I didn't just prove you wrong, I proved myself wrong." His mother's eyes welled with tears as she embraced him. Daniel extended a firm hand, whispering, "I respect you, son." James accepted the gesture, his heart lighter than it had ever been. Emma watched from the doorway, her lips curving into a quiet smile. For James, this was more than business triumph. It was healing wounds long left open. On the rooftop at dusk, James stood alone, gazing over the glowing city skyline. Emma stepped beside him, whispering, "You've come full circle." James replied quietly, "No, I've started a new circle." David's words echoed in his memory, "Outsmart him." Richard's defeat played faintly in his mind, but no longer with pain, only closure. Sophia's remorse lingered, but forgiveness felt possible in time. James whispered, "I'm not the man who fell. I'm the man who rose again." Emma smiled, gripping his hand as the sky blazed orange and violet. The city lights flickered to life, a mirror of the fire rekindled in his heart.